He was kind, thoughtful, friendly.
Pathological liar.
At the time, one would have said an answer to prayer, just what we needed.
Access to death-dealing drugs.
Always well-mannered, very polite.
Perfect predator.
Good company outside and extremely popular with everybody.
A killing machine.
Hyde, England, 1998. An elderly woman sits in her living room, waiting for her doctor. The doorbell rings. She smiles, welcoming in the man she trusts most with her life. Little does she know, he's there to end it. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was reality for over 200 people in this quiet English town. Their killer, the beloved Dr. Harold Shipman. Shipman wasn't just a serial killer. He was a loved and respected physician, a pillar of the community. For over 20 years, he played God, deciding who would live and who would die. His weapon wasn't a gun or a knife, but a syringe filled with diamorphine.
You've been to a house, rolled the sleeve up, administered morphine, killed her. That's what happened, isn't it, Doctor?
No.
How did this trusted doctor turn into Britain's most prolific serial killer? What drove him to murder the very people he swore to protect? And how did he get away with it for so long? Well, this is the shocking story of the world's kindest serial killer, the early years. Born in Nottingham in 1946, Harold Shipman grew up in a working-class family. His mother's death from lung cancer when he was 17 left a lasting impact. He witnessed her receiving morphine to ease her pain in her final days, a method he would later use on his victims. Shipman excelled in school and went on to study medicine at Leeds University. He graduated in 1970 and began his career as a general practitioner. In 1975, just a year into his first GP job in Todmorden, Shipman's career nearly ended before his killing spree began. Colleagues noticed his frequent requests for pethidine, a powerful painkiller. An investigation revealed he had been forging prescriptions to feed his growing addiction. Shipman was caught red-handed. The evidence was clear. He had written prescriptions for non-existent patients and even for his own use. In a normal world, this would have been the end of his medical career, but the system that was supposed to protect patients failed in a spectacular fashion. Instead of losing his license, Shipman was merely fined £600 and ordered to attend a drug rehabilitation center. He was allowed to continue practicing medicine, a decision that would have devastating consequences. This incident should have been a warning sign, a blaring alarm that something was seriously wrong with Dr. Shipman. But it was brushed aside, treated as a minor indiscretion rather than a fundamental breach of trust. Shipman moved to a new practice in Hyde in 1977, leaving behind his tarnished reputation in Todmorden. This move gave him a clean slate, an opportunity to start fresh. But instead of using this second chance to reform, Shipman began his descent into darkness, the perfect cover. In Hyde, Shipman quickly established himself as a caring, attentive doctor. He was particularly popular among elderly patients, known for his willingness to make house calls and his gentle bedside manner. This reputation would become his perfect cover for murder. Shipman's modus operandi was as simple as it was effective. He would visit elderly patients at home, often in the afternoon when he knew they would be alone. Under the guise of performing a routine checkup or administering treatment, he would inject them with a lethal dose of diamorphine, pharmaceutical heroin. Then, with a cold calculation that would chill investigators years later, Shipman would sit with his victims as they died. He would comfort them in their final moments, a twisted act of kindness from the very man who was ending their lives. After each murder, Shipman would meticulously falsify the victims' medical records. He would create a history of poor health, laying the groundwork for a plausible natural death. His medical expertise allowed him to craft convincing lies that went unquestioned for years. The first victims. Shipman's first confirmed victim was Eva Lyons, an 86-year-old widow who died on March 17, 1975. Lyons was a patient at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in Todmorden, where Shipman was working at the time. Her death, like so many that would follow, was attributed to natural causes. But it was in Hyde where Shipman's killing spree truly began in earnest. One of his early victims there was Lizzie Adams, a 77-year-old woman who died on February 28, 1997. Adams was in good health for her age, but Shipman recorded her death as due to a stroke. Another victim was Marie West, an 81-year-old who died on March 6, 1995. West's family remembered her as being in excellent spirits the day she died. Shipman listed her cause of death as a heart attack. These early murders set the pattern for Shipman's crimes. He targeted elderly women who lived alone, patients who trusted him implicitly, and whose deaths were less likely to raise suspicion. Shipman managed to avoid suspicion for so long through a combination of cunning, medical knowledge, and exploitation of systemic weaknesses. First, he spread out his murders over time and location. He didn't kill too many patients from the same street or in too short a time frame, which might have raised red flags. Second, he took advantage of the trust placed in doctors. In the UK, a single doctor could certify a death without any external verification. Shipman abused this trust, signing death certificates for his victims without anyone questioning his judgment. Third, he manipulated the cremation process. In the UK, cremation requires the signature of 2 doctors. Shipman would sign as the attending physician and then choose a second doctor who he knew wouldn't ask too many questions. Finally, Shipman was meticulous in creating false medical histories for his victims. He would backdate entries in their records, creating a trail of illness that made their deaths seem natural and expected. The breaking point. Despite Shipman's careful planning, suspicions eventually began to surface. In March 1998, Dr. Linda Reynolds of the Brooks Surgery in Hyde expressed concerns to John Pollard, the coroner for the South Manchester district, about the high death rate among Shipman's patients. Reynolds had noticed a disturbing pattern. Shipman was certifying an unusually high number of deaths, particularly among elderly women. Even more alarming, many of these deaths were occurring in the afternoon, shortly after Shipman had visited them. This led to the first police investigation into Shipman. However, the investigation was cursory at best. The detectives assigned to the case were inexperienced in medical matters and failed to check Shipman's records against the actual bodies of his victims. They accepted Shipman's explanations at face value, and the investigation was closed in April 1998. This failure allowed Shipman to kill 3 more people before he was finally caught. The final victim. Kathleen Grundy, former mayor of Hyde, became Shipman's last victim on June 24, 1998. Grundy, 81, was found dead in her home just hours after Shipman had visited her. As he had done so many times before, Shipman signed her death certificate, citing old age as the cause. But this time, Shipman made a crucial mistake. He forged a will in Grundy's name, leaving him £386,000, nearly her entire estate. This was out of character for Shipman, who had typically killed for the thrill rather than financial gain. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a solicitor. When she learned of the new will, her legal training kicked in. The will was clumsily forged, written on a typewriter, instead of being professionally prepared, as one would expect for such a large estate. Woodruff's suspicions were the thread that would finally unravel Shipman's web of deceit, the investigation that brought him down. Woodruff took her concerns to the police. This time, they listened. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles led the investigation, and he approached it with a thoroughness that had been lacking in previous inquiries. Grundy's body was exhumed and found to contain traces of diamorphine. Shipman claimed she had been an addict, but examination of his computer revealed he had written these notes after her death in a clumsy attempt to cover his tracks. As police dug deeper, the full horror of Shipman's crimes began to emerge. They looked into the deaths of other patients, finding a chilling pattern. Many elderly women had died in their homes shortly after a visit from Shipman. The afternoon timing of these deaths was particularly suspicious, as it allowed Shipman to discover the bodies himself and control the narrative. Investigators exhumed more bodies and found diamorphine in many of them. They also discovered that Shipman had stolen jewelry from some of his victims, keeping it as trophies. The most damning evidence came from Shipman's own computer. Police found that he had altered medical records, backdating entries to create false histories of illness for his victims. In some cases, he had recorded patient visits that never happened, creating alibis for himself. On September 7, 1998, Shipman was arrested. The game was up. The doctor who had played God for so long was finally facing justice. The trial. Shipman's trial began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. He was charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. These 15 cases were chosen as representative of his crimes, but investigators believed the true number of victims was far higher. The prosecution's case was damning. They presented evidence of Shipman's altered medical records, the stolen jewelry, and the traces of diamorphine found in exhumed bodies. They also called family members of victims who testified about their loved ones' good health shortly before Shipman's fatal visits. Throughout the trial, Shipman maintained his innocence. He showed no remorse, no emotion. His cold demeanor only served to strengthen the case against him. He refused to testify in his own defense, leaving his barrister to argue weakly that the deaths were coincidental. On January 31st, 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Shipman guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. But the story didn't end there. The Shipman inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, was established to investigate the full extent of his crimes. The inquiry's findings were shocking. Shipman had likely killed at least 218 patients, and possibly as many as 250. The inquiry also revealed systemic failures that had allowed Shipman to kill for so long. Death certification procedures were lax. There was little oversight of GPs working alone, and concerns raised by other healthcare professionals had been ignored. These findings led to significant changes in the UK healthcare system, collectively known as the Shipman effect. Death certification procedures were tightened. The use of controlled drugs became more strictly monitored, and there was a shift away from single-doctor practices. The final chapter. On January 13, 2004, Shipman was found hanged in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had used bed sheets tied to the window bars, taking his own life the day before his 58th birthday. His suicide denied his victims' families the closure they sought. Many had hoped he would eventually confess or provide some explanation for his actions. Instead, he took his secrets to the grave. The Shipman case left a lasting impact on British society. It shattered the image of the trusted family doctor and replaced it with fear and suspicion. It highlighted the vulnerability of the elderly and the potential for abuse within the medical system. But it also led to important reforms. The case taught us the importance of oversight in medical practice, the need for robust systems to detect unusual patterns of death, and the value of listening to concerns raised by healthcare professionals and patients' families. As we reflect on this dark chapter in medical history, we must remember the victims, not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by a man they trusted to care for them. Their stories and the changes made in response to this tragedy ensure that Shipman's victims did not die in vain. The story of Harold Shipman serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most benevolent facades. It challenges us to balance trust with vigilance, to question without becoming paranoid. In the end, it's a story about the complex nature of evil, the failures of systems meant to protect us, and the devastating consequences when those systems break down.